Hey class, this is Patrick. This is going to be a lecture session for Chapter 8, which is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Unfortunately, due to the rain, our class was canceled after we went through the homework. If you'd like to review the correct answers to the homework, they are in the slide section here. You can just take a look at them at your leisure. The slides are posted to Moodle, so you can take a look at them when you want. So I'm going to fast forward through them and we get right into Chapter 8, which is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In this lecture, we're going to go over aggregate demand. We're going to go over the factors that can change aggregate demand. We'll talk about the distinction between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. So we'll discuss a short-run equilibrium and a long-run equilibrium. And then we'll also discuss what's called the three states of the economy. Okay, so first, let's start off with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the quantity demanded of all goods and services, or real GDP, at different price levels, ceteris paribus. A thing to remember about the aggregate demand curve is, just like the demand curve, like we covered when we were kind of almost covering microeconomics, it's a downward sloping curve, so it looks a lot like that demand curve we talked about before, but it's an aggregated amount of goods. It's the goods and services produced throughout the entire society. So the aggregate demand curve is a curve that shows the quantity demanded of all goods and services, which could be thought of as real GDP at different price levels. And the reason the term price level is used is because, as you know from our previous chapter, the CPI is measuring prices across the board, not just for one good, but prices across the board. Long story short, aggregate is looking at totals. So the total demand throughout an entire economy is aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, specifying an inverse relationship between the price level and the quantity demanded of real GDP. In other words, this is a tricky way of saying it's a downward sloping curve. So aggregate demand is downward sloping, just like we saw when we were using a regular demand curve. It looks just the same. Now, there's several reasons why an aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So before I get into these reasons why, I want to classify something. One, you need to know the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. But do you have to know exactly why for the sake of your quiz? No. So these three things, although we're going to go over them, are not necessary for you to know for your quiz. So let's get started on why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. First, the real balance effect. This is the change in purchasing power of dollar-denominated assets that results from a change in the price level. So let's get a little bit more specific here. So let's just say the price level falls. As price level falls, let's take a step back. What happens? Well, our purchasing power, the money that we do have, our purchasing ability rises as the price level across the board, if prices fall across the board. Therefore, in a sense, our monetary wealth rises, and because of that, we can buy more goods and services. And hence, that's why we see a downward sloping curve. Of course, the opposite is true as well. As the price level rises, our purchasing power falls, and our monetary wealth falls, and therefore we buy fewer goods. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are worried about inflation, because, price level rising is inflation. So that's the real balance effect. That's one reason why the demand curve is downward sloping. Another reason is the interest rate effect. So, as the price level falls, purchasing power rises, just like we previously said, and therefore less money is needed to buy a fixed bundle of goods. Because there's less money is needed to buy a fixed bundle of goods, you have the ability to save more. And therefore, you are going to save more. And as you save more, the supply of credit rises. And as the supply of credit rises, interest rates are going to fall. Businesses and households are going to borrow more at lower interest rates, and therefore there's more goods bought and sold. The opposite holds true as well. If the price level rises, purchasing power falls, and therefore you may need to borrow in order to continue to buy a fixed bundle of goods. Therefore, demand for credit rises. As that happens, interest rates tend to rise. And businesses and households borrow less at higher interest rates, and therefore fewer goods are bought and sold. So, the second reason why the demand curve is downward sloping is the interest rate effect. Just to reiterate, this is not necessary to know for the quiz, but it's good to have a generalized knowledge of why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The final reason that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping is called the international trade effect. The price level in the U.S. falls relative to price levels across overseas. The U.S. goods become relatively less expensive than the foreign goods as that price level drops. So both Americans and foreigners buy more U.S. goods. And of course, the opposite holds true. If the price level in the U.S. rises relative to foreign price levels, U.S. goods are relatively more expensive than foreign goods, and both Americans and foreigners would buy fewer U.S. goods. Okay, so a change in the quantity demanded of real GDP is the result of a change in the price level. We went through this in chapter 3, if you recall back, and I said a change in price will lead to a change in quantity demanded in chapter 3. Same thing is holding true for this model. I know that they're different terms, but it's still a P and it's still a Q. The P now stands for price level rather than price, and the Q now stands for real GDP, but the same idea holds. A change in quantity demanded of real GDP is the result of a change in the price level. Okay? So that's something that you do need to know. A change in aggregate demand, or a shift in this curve, is different. So price level will not create a change in aggregate demand or a shift in the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve shifting is the exact same as we covered in chapter 3. When it increases, it moves to the right. When it decreases, it moves to the left. So what can change an aggregate demand curve? What are the factors that can change that? Well, we've already kind of covered them. If you recall back, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports less imports, can all affect aggregate demand. If you recall back, this was the elements involved in calculating GDP. So, if consumption falls, for example, aggregate demand falls. If investment falls, aggregate demand falls. If government spending falls, aggregate demand falls. And if net exports fall, aggregate demand falls. So, we can go through each of these, but it's going to reiterate what we just talked about. So the factors that can change aggregate demand are stuff like expectations of future prices. And the reason that expectation of future prices may change aggregate demand is it'll affect consumption. People will buy more now. So for example, if you think that oil prices are going to go up in September, you're more likely to buy oil now. And therefore aggregate demand for oil will, aggregate demand in general will go up. Expectations of lower prices may cause consumption to decline. And remember, when you talk about expectations, you're talking about prices declining in the future. Another thing that may affect aggregate demand is expectations of future income.